Everyone at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund wishes we were in Pennsylvania right now with the wall that heals as we had planned. We know that our in-memory families in Pennsylvania are disappointed that they won't be able to see their honorees' photos on display, but we didn't want to let the opportunity pass to remember our in-memory honorees from Pennsylvania. So we've put together this photo display with our traditional reading of the names. Robert Abraham, Charles Ackley, Milo Adams, Glenn Adams, Robert Badger, William Bailey, Donald Baird, Frank Balavage, Robert Benazek, Howard Bars, Gary Barth, Ralph Barzano, David Beatty, Robert Benzio, Roger Bernacki, Ronald Bernhardy. Kenneth Bloom, Joseph Boback, James Bowden, Joseph Borer, John Bolus, Harry Boring, Robert Bowser, Harold Boyce, David Boyd, William Breon, Stanley Brenton, William Broxson, David Bryson, Thomas Buckingham, Gary Berta, Harry Bouchard. Ronald Bing, Francis Cadwallader, Thomas Capoccioni, Herbert Carty, James Carpenter, George Carr, Gary Carr, Anthony Carcia, Russell Casadonte, William Charlton, John Chess, Vincent Chiappini, Suzanne Cisco, John Clemens, Edward Connolly, Richard Copenhaver. George Cornelius, William Cornwell, Doyle Cothran, Dale Coffenauer, Joseph Craig, Scott Craven, Donald Crow, Davidson Crumling, Philip Cummins, John Curry, John Dotavio, Terry Dando, John Dawson Sr., James Decker, David DeCourt, Richard Delaney. Paul DeLuca, William Demmel, Anthony Demito, Richard Deneen, Frank Derbyshire, Nicholas DeFiore, Kevin Donahue, Robert Doty, David Douglas, Donald Dunn, Ronald Ebersol, John Elm, Marvin Erb, Edward Erkinger, Edward Evans, William Evans. Charles Evans, Terry Evans, John Fiola, Ronald Fajbik, Antonino Farinella, Edward Feely, Albert Fedeli, James Fegley, Joseph Felke, William Fennell, James Fluck, Frederick Fogel, Jack Fontenot, Michael Ford, Jerry Foster, Anthony Foster. Dean Fowler, Regis Franciscus Jr., Delford Friedhoff, Bernard Friel, Richard Frohnauer, August Futema Jr., George Garcia, Jeffrey Gardner, Bruce Gassler, Alan Gatesman, Dennis Geary, Robert George, Thomas George, James Gift, Thomas Gillespie, Edward Gillen. David Gonkar, Robert Grace, Miles Grafe, John Graff, Thomas Grassa, Henry Gregg, Robert Gruber, Thomas Guffey, Dennis Gump, Michael Hake, Donald Hassler, Gerald Hatterer, Homer Hayes, Roy Hayes, Richard Hazelton, John Hecker. Jack Hedgelin, James Hefner, Henry Hogarty, James Hinkey, John Henson, Stephen Henney, Robert Herschel, John Hess, Charles Hess, Wayne Hiller, Joseph Hilliard, John Hiltner, George Himmelberger, Dennis Hindman, Harry Hurst, Francis Hoke. Daniel Hoke, Douglas Hoefel, Richard Hoko, John Hollander, Michael Husek, Lester Hoover, James Howard, James Howes, William Ibow, Raymond Iwanowski, Robert Yeager, Fred Johnson, Melvin Johnson, Donald Jones, Thomas Jones, Robert Jones. John Justice, Merle Kane, Thomas Kane, Dennis Kankey, Robert Kebzinski, Stanley Cates, Cameron Keister, Dennis Kepler, Robert Kerr, Louis Kiefer, John Klein, Bernard Kliss, Carl Nauer, Robert Konopka, David Kostin, John Kowalczyk. Dennis Kramer, Joseph Craddockville, William Cressley, Alan Kurtz, James Lane, Richard Lange, Michael Larkin, John Laser, Gerald Lefevre, Michael Lipka, Anthony Long, Douglas Lowry, Robert Mocker, Richard Mack, John Mack, Harry Mackle Jr. Gerald Maddox, Robert Malachowski, Gary Markle, Francis Markovic, Gerald Martick, John Madia Jr., Kenneth Matzis, James McAllister, Joseph McCabe, John McCabe, Donald McCanns, Bernard McLean, Patrick McClure, John McCullough, William McCurdy, Robert McElhenney. James McFarlane, Daniel McGinley, Paul McGrath, William McMahon, Gerard McManus, Harold McPherson, James McWilliams, Joseph Misick, Walter Mealy, James Mellett, Patrick Michael, William Mirzajewski, James Miller, Thomas Miller, Francis Miller, Jimmy Miller. Thomas Miller, Paul Miller Jr., Frank Moffett, David Monkelis, Richard Montoro, Edward Moore, Paul Moran, Kenneth Morgan, Kenneth Morrison, Carl Most, Thomas Mullen, Gerald Murray, Thomas Murray, Hallard Myers, John Nash, Jonathan Nelson. Donald Nemeth, Lee Newman, Jack Niedermeyer, Robert Nix, John Norton, Daniel O'Grady, David Omer, George Lelnick, Richard Osborne, Robert Pekowski, Richard Pazuski, Joseph Pallant, Daniel Papp, Nicholas Passamonti, Stephen Perlacki, Thomas Perry. Anthony Peters, Robert Petruska, Ronald Flugler, William Pierce, Thomas Piontko, David Pistachio, John Potenti, Paul Prebish, Dale Prindle, Angelo Pumello, Paul Radion, William Rangnow, Joseph Rashlich, Robert Reagan, Edwin Reed, Robert Rear, Keith Reeder, Gerald Regal, George Rhodes, Thomas Richards, Stanley Riddle, Robert Risky, Dallas Rowe, John Rogan, Richard Rogers, John Rolls, Ronald Rose, Norbert Rosenbaum, Len Ross, Mark Roth, Dominic Rotolo, Daniel Ruffing. Joseph Ruggiero, Ronald Sacchi, Joseph Salas, John Santer, James Scheiblein, Scott Schenk, Frank Schneider, George Cedar, Elmer Sonari, George Shannon, William Shea, Frank Shelmett, Joseph Shelsky, George Shukla, John Simon, Richard Simpson. Wilson Simpson, Robert Sittick, James Slusser, Ernest Smith, James Smith, John Smith, John Snyder, David Solik, Robert Spindler, William Stana, Erwin Stander, Ronald Strain, Stephen Sukumelli, Robert Sullivan, Stephen Svets, Michael Swartwood. William Swartz, Edward Swieger, Roderick Swigert, Raymond Taslet, William Tainter Jr., William Tammy, John Terrace, Roger Taylor, John Taylor, Thomas Thompson, James Thompson, John Tomeno, Daniel Tomko, John Toole, James Toscano, Richard Treese. Robert Treble, Dallas Tudor, Francis Turney, William Vasson, Russell Vigliotti, Frank Wojtek, William Waring, Terry Wagner, Ray Wagner, Michael Walsh, Thomas Walton, Darrell Warfel, Richard Watko, Leroy Wheeler, Clarence Winrick, Leland West. Stephen White, Richard Williams, Harry Williamson, Dale Wilson, Ronald Wilson, Kim Winter, George Henry Wise, Lee Whitman, Richard Whitwer, George Wojtovic, Chester Wolfe, Gary Wolfe, Walter Wolchin, Ernest Wright, Michael Yelka, Earl Young, Donald Zabawa, Bernard Zaleski, William Zellner. VVMF's In Memory program honors those who served in Vietnam, returned home, and later died. A ceremony is held each year on the site of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. to induct new veterans into the In Memory Honor Roll. To learn more or to nominate your Vietnam veteran to be honored for their service and sacrifice, please visit our website.